Civilizations rarely collapse in a single night. They decay slowly, almost invisibly, while ordinary people continue their routines beneath the illusion of permanence. Markets remain crowded, temples stay full, politicians promise stability. Families gather around dinner tables believing tomorrow will resemble yesterday. And yet beneath the polished surface of every great society before its fall, there is often another collapse already unfolding, a moral one. Not necessarily a collapse of laws, armies, or economies at first, but a gradual erosion of shared restraint, trust, duty, and meaning. History shows this pattern repeatedly, from imperial capitals glowing with wealth to republics convinced of their own invincibility. The collapse did not begin with chaos. It began quietly. It began when comfort replaced responsibility, when appearances mattered more than truth, and when entire populations stopped believing sacrifice was necessary for survival. By the time the signs became visible to everyone, the foundations had already started to rot beneath their feet. In the final centuries of the Roman Empire, visitors arriving in the capital encountered a city still magnificent beyond imagination. Marble temples reflected sunlight across crowded forums. Massive baths echoed with conversation and music. The arenas remained filled with cheering crowds demanding ever more extravagant spectacles. Senators wore silk imported from distant lands, while fountains flowed endlessly through public squares. To many citizens, Rome appeared eternal. But behind the theatrical image of strength, something fundamental had changed. Civic duty, once treated as sacred, became increasingly transactional. Military service was avoided by the wealthy. Political offices turned into opportunities for enrichment instead of responsibility. Corruption spread quietly through bureaucracies like moisture through stone walls. Ordinary people began losing faith not only in institutions, but in one another. Trust weakened. Public virtue became performance rather than conviction. And while enemies gathered along distant frontiers, the empire's deepest vulnerabilities were no longer outside its borders. They were already growing within the minds of its own citizens. Daily life inside declining civilizations often reveals warning signs long before official histories acknowledge them. In prosperous districts, luxury expands while social cohesion deteriorates. Entertainment grows more obsessive. Public discourse becomes louder, angrier, and increasingly detached from reality. In ancient Rome, critics of the era described streets filled with distraction and excess, while infrastructure slowly deteriorated in silence. Similar patterns appeared centuries later in other collapsing societies. In the final decades before the French Revolution, the aristocracy of Versailles surrounded itself with elaborate rituals, endless fashion, and extravagant celebrations, while famine spread through the countryside. The contrast became impossible to ignore, but no one understood what was coming next. Those benefiting from the system often mistake temporary comfort for permanent stability. The population adapts psychologically to visible inequality, institutional dishonesty, and moral exhaustion until abnormal conditions begin to feel ordinary. That normalization may be one of the most dangerous stages of societal decline. Moral decline rarely announces itself openly. It emerges through countless small decisions repeated over generations. A lie tolerated for convenience, a law ignored for profit, a betrayal justified by ambition. Over time, these choices accumulate until entire systems become incapable of sustaining themselves. Historians studying the fall of empires often focus on invasions, economic crises, or political assassinations. But beneath those visible events exists a deeper transformation, the weakening of collective responsibility. In stable societies, people generally believe they owe something to the future. They preserve institutions because they assume their children will inherit them, but when that connection disappears, short-term survival replaces long-term stewardship. Leaders prioritize immediate gain. Citizens retreat into private interests. Shared identity fractures into competing factions. The collapse did not begin with violence. It began when societies stopped seeing themselves as interconnected communities and started functioning as temporary collections of isolated individuals pursuing personal advantage above all else. One of the core patterns before social collapse is the erosion of trust. Trust in leadership, trust in justice, trust in information, trust between neighbors. Once this process accelerates, societies become vulnerable to panic, extremism, and paralysis. During the late years of the Weimar Republic in Germany, Inflation devastated ordinary families so severely that savings accumulated over decades became worthless almost overnight. Teachers, workers, and veterans watched their financial security evaporate, while political movements exploited fear and resentment. In that environment, truth itself became unstable. Rumors spread faster than facts. Conspiracy theories replaced rational debate. Citizens no longer believed institutions could protect them. And when populations lose confidence in systems meant to preserve order, they begin searching for certainty elsewhere, often in radical ideologies promising restoration, revenge, or national rebirth. By the time the signs became clear, it was already too late. Democratic structures remained standing physically, but psychologically, much of society had already abandoned them. As moral cohesion weakens, societies often compensate with spectacle. Leaders create distractions to preserve the illusion of control. Public attention becomes consumed by outrage, entertainment, and symbolic conflicts, while deeper structural problems continue expanding beneath the surface. Ancient Roman emperors organized increasingly extravagant games during periods of growing instability. Crowds filled amphitheaters while economic strain, political violence, and military fragmentation intensified beyond public view. Similar dynamics have appeared throughout history. In declining courts and unstable republics, appearances become everything. Governments project confidence, even as institutions decay internally. Citizens learn to perform loyalty publicly while privately losing faith. This split between external image and internal reality creates a dangerous psychological tension. Entire populations begin living inside narratives they no longer fully believe. And once a society becomes dependent on illusion to maintain stability, even small crises can trigger sudden and uncontrollable breakdowns. The breakdown of family structures and intergenerational continuity has also appeared repeatedly before periods of severe instability. In functioning civilizations, families often serve as the first institution through which values, discipline, identity, and historical memory are transmitted. But during periods of prolonged corruption and social fragmentation, these connections weaken. Economic pressures separate generations. Cultural values shift rapidly. Shared moral frameworks dissolve into confusion and conflict. In many declining empires, birth rates fell while social isolation increased among urban populations. Citizens became more detached from community obligations and more psychologically dependent on state systems or commercial entertainment. Loneliness expanded silently beneath visible prosperity. Meanwhile, younger generations inherited societies increasingly unable to explain what they stood for beyond consumption and survival. The consequences of this erosion are rarely immediate. They unfold slowly across decades until entire populations begin losing their sense of collective direction, purpose, and historical continuity. Economic collapse alone does not destroy civilizations. Many societies survive poverty, famine, and war. What often proves fatal is the moral reaction to crisis. Populations reveal the true strength or weakness of their social bonds. During stable periods, corruption can remain partially hidden beneath abundance. But when resources become limited, distrust accelerates rapidly. People hoard. Institutions fracture. Elites protect themselves while ordinary citizens lose faith in fairness. In the later years of the Soviet Union, shortages became increasingly common, despite official propaganda insisting stability remained intact. Citizens stood in endless lines for basic goods, while party officials enjoyed privileges unavailable to the general population. Cynicism spread through daily life. Public ideology survived externally, but internally, belief had already collapsed. The system continued functioning mechanically, even after millions stopped emotionally investing in it. And once enough people disengage psychologically from a civilization, its physical structures can unravel with astonishing speed. Throughout history, periods of moral decline have frequently coincided with growing hostility toward truth itself. Intellectuals become politicized, institutions manipulate information, public discourse transforms into performance rather than honest inquiry. In collapsing societies, facts become less important than emotional narratives capable of maintaining power or group identity. During moments of intense polarization, populations stop asking whether something is true and begin asking only whether it benefits their side. This transformation weakens the possibility of collective problem solving. Empires facing existential threats often fail, not because solutions are impossible, but because populations become incapable of agreeing on reality. Leaders exploit this confusion strategically, knowing fragmented societies are easier to control temporarily. But this strategy carries immense long-term risk. Once truth loses authority entirely, every institution becomes vulnerable to suspicion. Courts, elections, religious systems, universities, and media all begin appearing illegitimate to large portions of the population simultaneously. Another recurring sign before collapse is the replacement of competence with loyalty. In healthy societies, institutions tend to reward skill, discipline, and responsibility because survival depends on effective leadership. But during moral decline, systems increasingly prioritize obedience, image, and political convenience over merit. Corruption spreads upward. Critical positions are filled not by the most capable individuals, but by those most useful to ruling factions. Over time, institutional quality deteriorates gradually enough that many citizens fail to notice the danger until major crises expose catastrophic weaknesses. Armies lose discipline, infrastructure decays, bureaucracies become inefficient and self-protective. Disaster responses fail unexpectedly. In the Byzantine Empire's final centuries, political infighting repeatedly undermined military coordination, while internal rivalries consumed attention that should have focused on external threats. The empire still possessed wealth, history, and defensive walls, but internally, its ability to act cohesively had already begun collapsing long before Constantinople finally fell. Fear becomes one of the defining emotions inside declining civilizations. Not always visible fear, but quiet, chronic anxiety woven into daily existence. Citizens begin sensing instability without fully understanding its source. Prices rise unpredictably, institutions feel weaker, public hostility intensifies, people become emotionally exhausted from constant uncertainty. In these environments, many retreat psychologically into distraction, tribal identity, or private survival strategies. Others become radicalized by anger and humiliation. Social trust continues shrinking. Small conflicts escalate faster. Violence becomes more common not necessarily because populations become inherently crueler, but because systems capable of regulating behavior lose legitimacy. During the final years before the Yugoslav wars, neighbors who had lived peacefully beside each other for decades suddenly found themselves divided by fear, propaganda, and collapsing national identity. The transformations shocked the outside world, but for many inside the region, the emotional foundations of coexistence had already been deteriorating long before open conflict erupted. One of history's most haunting lessons is that collapse often feels impossible until the exact moment it becomes undeniable. Citizens living inside powerful civilizations struggle to imagine total breakdown because existing systems appear too vast, too advanced, or too interconnected to fail completely. The Roman Empire believed itself eternal. The aristocracy of pre-revolutionary France believed its hierarchy divinely protected. The Soviet Union appeared militarily indestructible only years before its dissolution. But no civilization is immune to internal erosion. The collapse did not begin with invaders crossing borders or crowds storming palaces. It began quietly, inside ordinary habits, weakened values, normalized corruption, and fading trust. By the time visible crisis arrives, societies are often already psychologically fragmented beyond easy repair. External disasters merely expose fractures that have existed internally for years, sometimes generations. Yet history also reveals something equally important. Moral decline is never entirely abstract. It is lived through individual choices repeated collectively across society. Every civilization is shaped not only by rulers and armies, but by the daily decisions of ordinary people. Whether truth matters, whether duty matters, whether future generations matter. Collapse becomes possible when enough individuals conclude that responsibility belongs to someone else. And while empires eventually disappear, the human patterns behind their destruction remain remarkably consistent across centuries. That is why these stories continue to feel unsettlingly familiar. They force societies to confront uncomfortable questions about themselves. Questions about what holds civilizations together when laws fail, when economies weaken, and when fear spreads faster than solidarity. Because in the end, history suggests that societies rarely die only from external attack. More often, they begin collapsing long before anyone notices, from within.